The first Italian soldier crested the ridge at dawn, silhouetted against the pale Sicilian sky, and Corporal Daniel Reeves put a round through his chest before man even saw him. The second soldier appeared 3 seconds later, and Reeves fired again, the M1 Garand's action cycling with mechanical precision. By the time the third and fourth soldiers realized they were walking into a kill zone, Reeves had already shifted his aim and fired twice more, and the rocky hillside that was supposed to be undefended had suddenly become the most dangerous piece of ground in southern Sicily. The date was July 12, 1943, and what the Italian company advancing up that slope didn't know was that the lone American corporal waiting for them had no intention of retreating, no support coming, and nothing but 8 rounds in his rifle, 100 more in his pouches, and a position so perfectly chosen that numbers wouldn't matter nearly as much as geometry and will. Sicily in July 1943 was an island caught between empires. The Allied invasion, Operation Husky, had begun on July 10th with massive amphibious landings along the southern coast, and now American, British, and Canadian forces were pushing inland against German and Italian defenders who had had years to prepare defensive positions in some of the most challenging terrain in the Mediterranean. The landscape itself was a weapon. Steep hills rising from coastal plains, valleys that funneled movement into predictable corridors, roads that twisted through terrain where every bend offered potential ambush, and summer heat so brutal it turned physical exertion into an exhausting struggle against dehydration and heat stroke. The Italian forces defending Sicily were a mixed-quality force. Some units were veteran formations with combat experience in North Africa, well-led and competently trained. Others were coastal defense battalions filled with older men and reluctant conscripts who'd been told they were defending Italian soil, but who had little enthusiasm for dying for Mussolini's collapsing empire. The German units stiffening the Italian defense were another matter entirely. Professional, experienced, and determined to make the Allies pay for every mile. Daniel Reeves was 23 years old and had been in the Army for 18 months. Most of that time spent training in the States before shipping to North Africa in May. He was from rural Virginia, the son of a tobacco farmer who taught him to shoot before he taught him to read. And he'd grown up in a world where marksmanship was a practical skill rather than a sport. You shot to put food on the table, to protect livestock from predators, and because ammunition cost money and wasting it was wasteful. By the time Daniel was 15, he could hit a running rabbit at 70 yards with his father's old Winchester, and by the time he enlisted after Pearl Harbor, he was probably a better rifleman than 90% of the men the Army was trying to train. The Army recognized this quickly, at basic training. He qualified expert with every weapon they put in his hands. At advanced infantry training, instructors use him as an example of proper shooting technique. By the time his unit, a regiment of the 45th Infantry Division, deployed to the Mediterranean, Daniel was a corporal leading a rifle squad and carrying the weapon that would define American infantry in World War II, the M1 Garand. The M1 Garand was revolutionary in ways that aren't immediately obvious until you understand what it replaced. Most armies in World War II equipped their infantry with bolt-action rifles. The German K98K, the British Linfield, the Soviet Mosin-Nagant. These were solid, reliable weapons, but they required the shooter to manually cycle the action after each shot, which slowed the rate of fire, and required the shooter to break their sight picture and body position with each cycle. The M1 Garand was semi-automatic. It used the gas pressure from a fired round to automatically eject the spent casing and chamber a new round, allowing the shooter to fire as fast as they could pull the trigger without ever taking their eye off the target or moving their body. It held 8 rounds in an internal clip that ejected automatically when empty, producing a distinctive ping that became one of the characteristic sounds of American infantry combat. General George Patton called it the greatest battle implement ever devised, and while that was hyperbole, it wasn't absurd hyperbole. An American rifleman with an M1 could put accurate fire on target at nearly twice the rate of an enemy rifleman with a bolt-action rifle, and in infantry combat where seconds mattered and volume of accurate fire often determined who lived and who died, that advantage was enormous. Daniel understood the M1 intimately. He'd fired thousands of rounds through in training, learned its quirks and characteristics, discovered that it shot slightly left at ranges beyond 300 yards, and that the trigger had a tiny bit of creep before it broke cleanly. He'd learned to load it smoothly without catching his thumb in the action, a mistake that led to painful injuries and the nickname M1 Thumb among careless soldiers. He'd learned to maintain it obsessively because the gas system that made it semi-automatic also made it more sensitive to dirt and carbon buildup than a simple bolt action. Most importantly, he'd learned to shoot it accurately under pressure, to control his breathing and trigger press even when his heart was pounding and adrenaline was screaming at him to rush. By the time the 45th Division landed in Sicily on July 10th, Daniel was as competent with his rifle as any infantryman in the American Army. And he was about to discover exactly how much that competence was worth when the institutional support of modern military disappeared and left him alone with nothing but his weapon and his training. The situation that led to Daniel's isolated stand developed through a series of small failures that cascaded into a tactical disaster. His company had been tasked with securing a ridgeline that overlooked a key road junction the division needed to control for its advance inland. The mission was supposed to be straightforward: advance during darkness, secure the high ground before dawn, and hold it while engineers improved the road for supply trucks and armor. But the intelligence that said the ridge was lightly defended or possibly undefended turned out to be wrong. There was an Italian battalion in the area, and while they weren't occupying the ridge itself, they were close enough to respond when American forces started climbing toward it. Contact came just before dawn, when Daniel's platoon was strung out on a steep slope, exhausted from hours of night movement through terrain that was harder to traverse than maps suggested. Machine gun fire from an unexpected direction scattered the platoon, killing the lieutenant and 2 squad leaders in the first burst. In the confusion that followed, squads fragmented as men sought cover, lost contact with each other in the darkness, and struggled to understand what was happening and where the fire was coming from. Daniel's squad had been near the front of the platoon column, and when the firing started, they were perhaps 200 yards from the crest of the ridge. Daniel's immediate reaction, trained into him through endless repetitive drills, was to get his men off the exposed slope and into cover. He led them upward rather than down, because the terrain offered better cover above, and because retreating downhill meant running directly into whatever enemy force was behind them. They scrambled up the last stretch of slope in darkness, scraping hands and knees on volcanic rock, and reached the ridgeline just as dawn was breaking enough to see. What Daniel found was both better and worse than he'd feared. Better because the military crest of the ridge, the position slightly below the actual crest that offered fields of fire without silhouetting defenders against the skyline, was unoccupied and offered excellent cover in the form of rock outcroppings and a low stone wall that some farmer had built decades earlier. Worse because when Daniel looked back down the slope, he could see his platoon was completely scattered, men pinned down or displaced, with no coherent offensive line and no apparent leadership pulling them together. And worse still because when he looked to his left along the ridge, he could see movement. Italian infantry, a lot of them, advancing along the ridgeline from the direction of their own positions, clearly intending to occupy the high ground and roll up the scattered American platoon from above. Daniel had perhaps 90 seconds to make decisions that would determine whether he and his squad lived or died. His training said he should try to link up with the rest of the platoon, re-establish contact with whatever leadership still existed, and act as part of a coordinated defense. But his instinct and his quick assessment of terrain told him that retreating back down the slope meant abandoning the best defensive position available and moving into chaos where he'd have no clear fields of fire and no way to use his rifle's advantages effectively. The ridgeline position offered something rare and valuable. Clear sight lines in multiple directions could cover an elevation advantage. If he could hold it even briefly, he might slow the Italian advance enough for the scattered platoon below to reorganize. If he abandoned it, the Italians would occupy it and use it to destroy what remained of the American force. The decision was instinctive more than calculated. Daniel told his squad, 7 men including himself, to find firing positions along the stone wall and prepare to engage targets approaching from the left. Then he positioned himself at the end of the wall that offered the best field of fire and waited for the Italians to come into range. They came confidently at first, a company-sized formation, perhaps 80 men advancing in a tactical column along the ridge, clearly expecting no resistance or at most scattered resistance from a defeated enemy. They weren't advancing carelessly. There were scouts out front, and the formation showed tactical discipline. But they weren't expecting what Daniel had positioned to meet them. A defended position with clear fields of fire and American riflemen with semi-automatic weapons. The lead Italian scouts came into Daniel's effective range at approximately 200 yards, moving along the ridge in the growing dawn light. Daniel let them close to 150 yards, wanting to be certain of hits and wanting his squad's fire to have maximum effect when it came. Then he fired, and the lead scout dropped. He fired again immediately, the M1's action cycling automatically, and the second scout went down. His squad opened fire a half-second later, a ragged volley that dropped 3 more Italians and sent the rest diving for cover. What followed was a firefight that lasted approximately 20 minutes, but that felt to Daniel like hours. The Italians, surprised but not panicked, attempted to deploy from column into line and bring their superior numbers to bear. Daniel and his squad engaged every target that presented itself, firing with disciplined precision rather than panic spraying. The M1 semi-automatic capability meant that Daniel could fire, assess the hit, and immediately engage another target without taking his eye from his sight picture or losing his firing position. The Italians, armed primarily with Carcano bolt-action rifles, could return fire but at a slower rate and with less accuracy because they were advancing into fire rather than shooting from prepared positions. The stone wall that Daniel had chosen for his position turned out to be perfect. It was high enough to provide solid cover when he ducked behind it, but low enough that he could fire over from a stable, supported position that minimized his exposure. The volcanic rock absorbed rifle bullets without shattering into dangerous fragments, and the wall's irregular construction meant there were multiple firing positions along its length that Daniel could shift between to avoid becoming predictable. The Italian company commander, whoever he was, made a decision that was tactically sound but operationally doomed by the terrain and by Daniel's position. He attempted to flank the American position by sending a platoon-sized element farther left along the ridge to get around the stone wall and attack Daniel's squad from the side. Daniel saw this movement developing and understood immediately what it meant. If the flanking force succeeded, his position would become untenable and his squad would be destroyed. But the terrain that had made his firing position so strong also limited the Italian flanking movement. They had to traverse a section of ridge that offered almost no cover, a stretch of perhaps 80 yards that was completely exposed to fire from Daniel's position. It was a calculated risk on the Italian commander's part, betting that his flanking force could cross that killing ground quickly enough to avoid excessive casualties. It was a wrong bet. Daniel shifted his position to the left end of the stone wall, taking a firing stance that gave him a clear view of the exposed section of ridge. As the Italian flanking force emerged into that open ground and began their rush toward cover, Daniel engaged them methodically, firing as fast as he could acquire targets, letting the M1's automatic action cycle, while he focused entirely on sight picture and trigger press. He fired 8 rounds, heard the distinctive ping as the empty clip ejected, reloaded smoothly without looking down, and fired 8 more rounds. In less than 20 seconds, he personally killed or wounded 7 men, and his squad's fire accounted for several more. The flanking attempt broke, survivors retreating back to cover, and the Italian advance stalled. But stalling the advance wasn't the same as stopping it, and Daniel knew that his position was degrading by the minute. His squad had taken casualties. 1 man was dead from a lucky Italian shot that had found a gap in the wall's cover. Another was wounded badly enough that he couldn't fight effectively. Ammunition was being consumed at a rate that couldn't be sustained indefinitely. Daniel had fired perhaps 50 rounds already, nearly half his basic load, and his remaining men were in similar situations. The Italians, despite their casualties, still outnumbered the American squad by at least 5 to 1, and they were starting to demonstrate better fire discipline and tactical coordination as their initial surprise wore off. Daniel could see officers moving among the Italian positions, reorganizing men, preparing for what would likely be a coordinated assault that would use suppressing fire to pin the Americans while assault elements closed the distance. If that assault came with proper coordination, Daniel's squad would be overrun through sheer weight of numbers regardless of how well they shot. Then something changed in the tactical situation below the ridge. Daniel heard the distinct sound of American machine gun fire, the rapid hammering of a .30 caliber Browning, coming from a position somewhere down the slope where a scattered platoon had been pinned. Someone had gotten a machine gun into action, and that someone was engaging Italian positions at the base of the ridge with sustained, disciplined fire. The Italian company that had been advancing along the ridge suddenly had a serious problem. They were taking effective fire from below, while simultaneously stalled in their attempt to overrun the American position above. Their tactical situation had shifted from offensive to precarious. Daniel could see confusion in the Italian positions. Men looking back toward where machine gun fire was coming from. Officers trying to make decisions about whether to continue the attack on the ridge or deal with the threat from below. That moment of confusion and hesitation was a tactical opportunity that Daniel recognized instantly and exploited without conscious thought. He increased his rate of fire, engaging every Italian soldier he could see, forcing them to keep their heads down, denying them the ability to organize. His remaining squad members followed his lead, and for approximately 2 minutes the Stonewall position became a source of such concentrated, accurate fire that the Italians could neither advance nor effectively return fire. The Italian company commander made the rational decision under the circumstances. He pulled his forces back. It wasn't a rout or a panic retreat, but it was a withdrawal under fire, men pulling back by teams while others provided covering fire, giving up the ground they gained along the ridge and falling back toward their own defensive positions farther west. Daniel continued to engage targets as they withdrew, making the Italians pay for every yard of their retreat, until they finally moved out of effective range and the firing tapered off. The sudden silence after 20 minutes of sustained gunfire was disorienting, the absence of sound almost painful after the hammering noise of rifle fire and the crack of bullets passing overhead. Daniel's ears were ringing so badly he could barely hear. His shoulder ached from the M1's recoil. His hands were shaking from adrenaline, and he was suddenly aware that his mouth was so dry he could barely swallow. He looked along the stone wall at what remained of his squad, 4 men still able to fight, 1 dead, 2 wounded. He looked at the ground in front of the wall and along the exposed section of ridge where the Italian flanking attempt had failed, and he counted bodies. 14 Italians were clearly dead within his field of view, perhaps twice that many were wounded based on the blood trails and the movements he'd seen during the withdrawal. The machine gun fire from below had stopped, and Daniel could hear American voices shouting. The sound of organized movement, the unmistakable cadence of NCOs getting men into formation. His scattered platoon was pulling itself together, and now friendly forces were advancing up the slope toward his position. A sergeant Daniel recognized, a man named Kowalski from another squad, reached the stone wall position and stared at the scene with an expression of shocked disbelief. Kowalski asked what the hell had happened, and Daniel, his voice hoarse from cordite fumes and dehydration, said they'd held the ridge. Kowalski looked at the small pile of empty M1 clips beside Daniel's position, looked at the Italian bodies scattered across the slope and ridge, looked at the 5 exhausted men who'd somehow stopped a force 10 times their size, and said something profane and admiring that Daniel was too exhausted to fully register. Over the following hours, as the American forces consolidated their hold on the ridge, and the full scope of what had happened became clear, the tactical picture emerged. The Italian force that Daniel's squad had engaged was approximately a reinforced company, somewhere between 80 and 100 men. Daniel's squad, 7 men reduced to 5 effectives by the end of the engagement, had killed at least 20 Italians and wounded perhaps 40 more based on the evidence collected from the battlefield and from Italian prisoners captured later. Daniel himself, firing from his position at the stone wall, had personally killed or wounded at least 18 men in approximately 20 minutes of fighting. The M1 Garand in his hands had fired over 90 rounds during the engagement, and the rifle had functioned flawlessly despite the heat, the sustained rate of fire, and the dust and carbon buildup that would have choked a less robust weapon. The position Daniel had chosen had been so tactically advantageous, and his exploitation of the M1's capabilities so effective, that he'd achieved something that military theorists would have said was impossible. A single squad with no support had stopped and defeated an enemy force more than 10 times larger in a meeting engagement. The battalion commander, when he visited the position later that day, walked the ground personally, examined the fields of fire, looked at the stone wall and the dead Italians, and asked Daniel a series of questions about his decisions and his tactics. Daniel answered as clearly as his exhaustion allowed, explaining his choice of position, his firing discipline, his decision to engage the flanking force in the exposed ground. The colonel listened, nodded, and told Daniel he was being recommended for the Silver Star. Then he asked Daniel how he'd stayed calm enough to shoot with precision under that kind of pressure. outnumbered and isolated with no support. Daniel thought about it for a moment and said honestly that he hadn't felt calm at all, that he'd been terrified the entire time, but that his father had taught him that panic wasted ammunition, and ammunition was too valuable to waste, and somehow that lesson had stuck even when the stakes were life and death rather than rabbits and squirrels. The Silver Star recommendation was approved, and Daniel received it in a brief ceremony a month later in a dusty Sicilian village. He continued to serve through the rest of the Sicily campaign, and then through the brutal Italian mainland fighting at Salerno and Anzio. He survived the war, returned to Virginia, married his high school sweetheart, and took over his father's tobacco farm. He never spoke much about Sicily or the Ridge or the 20 Minutes when he'd held off an Italian company with nothing but an M1 rifle and a good position. When his sons asked about the war years later, he told them stories about his buddies, about the Italian countryside, about the fear and the boredom and the cold, but he rarely mentioned the killing. The Silver Star hung in a drawer for decades. It wasn't until after Daniel died in 1989 that his family found the citation and understood what he'd done on that Sicilian ridge in July 1943. The tactical lessons from Daniel's stand on the ridge were studied at Fort Benning and incorporated into infantry training doctrine, though usually without attribution to a specific soldier or engagement. The importance of terrain selection, the force multiplication effect of superior positioning, the advantage that semi-automatic rifles provided over bolt-action weapons in sustained firefights, the psychological impact of discipline, accurate fire on an attacking force, all of these became teaching points for infantry officers and NCOs training the next generation of American soldiers. But the lessons extracted for institutional use missed something essential about what had actually happened on that ridge, something that couldn't be reduced to tactical diagrams or doctrinal bullet points. What happened there wasn't just about terrain, or weapons, or tactics. It was about a 23-year-old corporal from rural Virginia who'd been taught by his father that ammunition was too valuable to waste, who'd internalized through years of practice what it meant to shoot with precision under pressure, and who, when confronted with an impossible situation, refused to accept that impossibility meant defeat. The story of Daniel Reeves and his defense of the Sicilian Ridge is significant not because it was unique in the sense that no other soldier ever achieved similar results, but because it illustrates with stark clarity a set of principles about warfare that remain relevant regardless of technology or era. The first principle is that tactical skill and superior positioning can overcome numerical disadvantage far more effectively than conventional wisdom suggests. Military planning typically assumes that force ratios matter enormously, that attacking forces need numerical superiority to overcome defensive advantages, that a force outnumbered 10-1 cannot hold against determined assault. Daniel's stand proved that under specific conditions, those assumptions are wrong. With clear fields of fire, good cover, superior weapons, and sufficient skill to exploit those advantages, a small force can inflict disproportionate casualties on a larger force, and break there will continue attacking. The key phrase is under specific conditions, and Daniel's genius, if it can be called that, was in recognizing that the conditions existed and in positioning himself to exploit them. The second principle is about the relationship between technology and training. The M1 Garand was a technologically superior weapon compared to bolt-action rifles the Italians carried, but superior technology alone doesn't guarantee superior results. A poorly trained soldier with an M1 would have wasted its semi-automatic capability by firing too fast without aiming, burning through ammunition without achieving hits. Daniel's effectiveness came from combining the M1's technological advantage with training and discipline that let him use that advantage precisely as it was meant to be used, maintaining high rates of accurate fire without losing precision to haste. This suggests that investment in training force multiplies the value of investment in technology, and that advanced weapons in untrained hands are often less effective than simple weapons in skilled hands. The third principle is psychological, and perhaps the most important. Daniel was terrified throughout the engagement. He said so explicitly when the colonel asked him. Fear is a universal constant in combat, the emotional reality that every soldier experiences regardless of training or temperament. What separates soldiers who remain effective under extreme stress from those who don't isn't the absence of fear, but the presence of training so deeply internalized that it functions even when conscious thought is compromised by adrenaline and terror. Daniel's father teaching him not to waste ammunition thousands of repetitions in training teaching the mechanics of loading and firing and aiming. These experiences created behavioral patterns that operated automatically when Daniel's conscious mind was overwhelmed by fear. This is why military training emphasizes repetition to the point of boredom. Why soldiers practice basic tasks until they can perform them while exhausted and terrified. Why doctrine stresses immediate action drills that don't require thought. The goal isn't to eliminate fear, but to create responses that function despite fear. The broader context of Daniel's story within the Sicily campaign reveals something about the nature of the Italian military's collapse in 1943. The Italian forces defending Sicily weren't uniformly incompetent or cowardly, though Allied propaganda sometimes portrayed them that way. Many Italian units fought with competence and courage, and some German commanders considered certain Italian formations to be reliable. But the Italian military in 1943 was suffering from a crisis of legitimacy and morale that went beyond tactical capability. Most Italian soldiers by that point understood that they were fighting for a regime that was losing the war, that Italy itself had nothing to gain from continuing the fight, and that dying for Mussolini's ambitions was meaningless. This psychological reality meant that Italian units often fought effectively when they had clear advantages and strong leadership, but broke quickly when faced with unexpected resistance, or when casualties mounted beyond what seemed acceptable for a war they no longer believed in. The Italian company that attacked Daniel's position probably expected minimal resistance, expected that numerical superiority would be decisive, and when they encountered sustained, accurate fire from a defended position and took casualties that exceeded their psychological threshold, their will to continue attacking evaporated. This wasn't cowardice. It was rational calculation by men who saw no reason to die for a lost cause. The ethical dimension of Daniel's story is less complicated than some combat narratives, but still worth acknowledging. Daniel killed at least 18 men and wounded many more, all of them in a defensive engagement where his own life and the lives of his squad were at immediate risk. There's no moral ambiguity about self-defense in combat. Soldiers on both sides understood they were engaged in warfare, where killing was the essential function. Daniel expressed no guilt about the killing in the few times he spoke about it, and his post-war silence on the topic seemed to have been more about not wanting to relive traumatic experiences than about wrestling with moral questions. This stands in contrast to stories of snipers or long-range marksmen who kill from concealment and sometimes struggle with the psychological weight of deliberate, distant killing. Daniel's killing was immediate, reactive, defensive, and unambiguous in its moral context. The men he killed were trying to kill him, and his shooting was a direct means of preventing that outcome. If there was psychological cost, it wasn't moral guilt, but rather the trauma of sustained life-or-death violence and the loss of squad members he trained with and led. The technological narrative around the M1 Garand deserves emphasis because it represents a broader pattern in American military development. The United States entered World War II with significant advantages in industrial capacity and technological innovation, and the M1 was one of the clearest examples of how those advantages translated to battlefield effectiveness. Most armies in 1943 were still issuing bolt-action rifles designed before World War I, because those rifles were simple, cheap, and adequate for the way those armies expected to fight. The United States, with greater industrial resources and a different doctrinal approach that emphasized firepower over manpower, invested in developing and mass-producing a semi-automatic rifle that was more complex and expensive, but that gave individual soldiers significantly greater combat power. This decision, made years before the war in planning rooms and design bureaus, directly contributed to Daniel's survival and success on that Sicilian ridge. He had better equipment than his opponents because his nation had invested in developing that equipment. And in combat, that equipment advantage mattered enormously. The final lesson from Daniel Reeves' story is about the distance between individual actions and institutional recognition. Daniel's stand on the ridge was tactically significant, prevented the collapse of his platoon, killed or wounded 40 enemy soldiers, and earned him a Silver Star. But his name doesn't appear in histories of the Sicily campaign. His action isn't taught as a case study, except in anonymous form, and his contribution to the war effort is invisible except to those who knew him personally or who happened to read his Silver Star citation. This is the norm rather than the exception. Most extraordinary individual actions in warfare go unrecorded or are recorded only in the fading memories of participants. The official history captures the large-scale movements, the division and corps-level operations, the strategic decisions, but misses the thousands of individual moments of courage or skill or innovation that collectively determine outcomes. Daniel's story survived by accident because a battalion commander thought to document it, and because a Silver Star citation preserved the basic facts. Countless similar stories didn't survive at all, and the men who performed similar feats died unknown or lived quietly afterward with their experiences known only to themselves. In the end, the story of Daniel Reeves on Sicilian Ridge in July 1943 is a story about competence under pressure, about making the most of advantageous circumstances, and about refusing to accept that numerical disadvantage means inevitable defeat. It's a story about technology and training combining to create combat effectiveness greater than either could produce alone. It's a story about a young man from rural Virginia who'd learned to shoot because ammunition was too valuable to waste, and who, when faced with 40 Italian soldiers attacking his position, simply did what he'd been trained to do: found good cover, picked his targets, controlled his breathing, pressed the trigger, and let the M1 Garand semi-automatic action, given rate of fire, he needed to survive. There was no glory in it, no triumphant conclusion, just the brutal arithmetic of defensive fire and the stubborn determination of a corporal who decided that the ridge was worth holding and that retreating wasn't an option he was willing to consider. He held. The Italians broke. And when it was over, Daniel Reeves was still alive, still holding his rifle, still occupying the stone-wall position that had become a killing ground for men who thought they were attacking a defeated enemy. That's the story. That's what happened. And it's worth remembering not because it was unique, but because it illustrates what's possible when skill, courage, and circumstance align in those rare moments when everything depends on what one person can accomplish with the tools they've been given and the training they've internalized. Subscribe for more untold stories of courage from the greatest generation.